Imagine yourself being chained in the belly of a ship for 8 months, sailing toward a land that doesn't want you, to build a nation that will pretend you never existed. Now, most of you are probably thinking of something else, but what if I told you that this nightmare was actually the foundation of modern Australia? Welcome aboard Arnie's Brain Train. I'm Alex Arnold, and today I'm going to be time traveling to uncover one of history's most brutal social experiments that shaped an entire continent. Today our brain train is taking us deep down under into Britain's Australian penal colonies. Now, we're not going to just do the sanitized version that you might have heard before, but this is the raw, unfiltered reality experienced by convicts, soldiers, and clergymen who lived through this historical nightmare. What you're about to discover will completely change how you see Australia's origin story. It's not just ancient history, but the psychological scars and social patterns that we'll explore still echo through Australian society today, influencing everything from their immigration policies to their cultural attitudes about crime and punishment. All of my sources are listed in the description below, so you can continue your own brain train journey after this video. Let's go ahead and dive in. Our story takes us back to London in the 1780s, overcrowded, crime-ridden, and facing a prison crisis that would make today's problems seem trivial. The city was drowning in poverty, and with it came desperation that drove ordinary people to extraordinary crimes. A loaf of bread cost a day's wages for the poor, so stealing food wasn't just common, it was survival. Britain's jails were bursting at the seams with over 8,000 prisoners crammed into spaces meant for half that number. Disease spread like wildfire through these human warehouses, and the American Revolution had just cut off their previous dumping ground for criminals. The government needed a solution, and they needed it fast. Now, right from the get-go, the story immediately gets chilling. The decision makers weren't panicking, they were just busy calculating. Enter Australia, a mysterious continent on the other side of the world, perfect for Britain's grand experiment in human disposal. The politicians sold this idea as humanitarian reform, arguing that transportation gave criminals a chance at redemption rather than the gallows. But here's where the story really gets dark. This wasn't just about solving a prison problem. This was about creating a self-sustaining colony built entirely on forced labor and human suffering, while simultaneously clearing Britain's undesirable population. Now, the masterminds behind this scheme may seem like cartoon villains, but they were actually respected politicians and administrators who genuinely believed they were being progressive and humane. Lord Sydney, the Home Secretary, argued passionately in Parliament that transportation was merciful compared to execution. He painted pictures of convicts starting fresh lives as farmers and tradesmen in a new world. But mercy for whom? Certainly not for the estimated 162,000 men, women, and children who would be shipped to Australia over the next 80 years. The reality was that the transportation became a death sentence with extra steps, slower, more profitable, and conveniently out of sight from British voters. Unfortunately, this horrific system was designed to be self-perpetuating. Convicts would build the infrastructure to house more convicts, grow food to feed more convicts, and eventually some would become guards over newer convicts. It was a pyramid scheme of human misery that generated wealth for British administrators while disposing of society's problems. When the first fleet actually set sail in 1787, it carried 759 convicts, 13 children, and about 250 Marines and officials. What the history books often skip is the brutal mathematics. This wasn't colonization, it was human trafficking on an industrial scale. The convicts weren't just hardened criminals, but they included political prisoners who dared speak against the government, debtors whose only crime was poverty, poachers who hunted on land that had become common for centuries but was suddenly privatized, and people whose only crime was stealing bread to survive. Some were as young as 9 years old, sentenced to 7 years transportation for stealing handkerchiefs or apples. But here's the part that really gets me, and this is where you start to see the original sin taking shape. The British government knew exactly what they were doing. Internal correspondence between officials reveals that they understood the mortality rates, the brutal conditions, and the psychological devastation that they were inflicting. They just didn't care because these weren't considered full human beings deserving of basic dignity. Let's go into some of the individual experiences of some of these people that made it to Australia. First, we'll step into the shoes of Mary Bryant, a 21-year-old woman convicted of highway robbery, though her highway robbery was actually begging on a road and taking a silk bonnet from a wealthy woman who refused to help her starving family. Picture yourself chained below deck for 8 months, unable to stand upright, sharing space with dozens of other terrified souls, all because you stole a bonnet. Mary witnessed fellow prisoners die from disease, malnutrition, and despair. The mortality rate on these ships averaged 10 to 15%, but that's just a statistic until you realize that means 1 in every 10 people who started the journey never saw land again. Their bodies were simply thrown overboard like cargo. The conditions weren't accidentally harsh either. They were designed to break spirits before arrival. Convicts were fed maggoty biscuits that were often so hard that they had to be soaked in their own urine to become edible. They were given minimal water, often less than what we'd give farm animals today. They lived in their own filth, developed scurvy, typhus, and dysentery, and many went insane from the psychological torture of confinement. The ship's surgeons documented these conditions in detail, sending reports back to London that were filed away and ignored. Unfortunately, but as you can expect, women faced additional horrors that were systematically covered up by official records. Sexual assault was routine, pregnancy was common, and survival for mother and child was unlikely. Female convicts were literally listed in ships' manifests as cargo, often described alongside livestock and supplies. Think about that. Human beings reduced to inventory items. Many women arrived pregnant with children fathered by crew members, Marines, or male convicts. But these assaults were never prosecuted because the victims were considered criminals without legal standing. Here's what you need to understand about why this history matters to you today. These weren't isolated incidents or unfortunate accidents. This was systematic dehumanization on a massive scale that established patterns of thinking about who deserves basic human rights and dignity. These attitudes didn't disappear when the last convict ship arrived. They became embedded in Australian culture and institutions. You can trace direct lines from these 18th century attitudes to modern Australia's treatment of asylum seekers, Indigenous peoples, and anyone society deems undesirable. Upon their arrival, convicts discovered that the fresh start promised by British courts was actually a death sentence with extra steps. They were immediately put to work clearing dense forests with primitive tools, axes that broke hours after use, saws that bent in the humid heat, and wheelbarrows that fell apart under the weight of rocks and dirt. They were forced to build their own prisons, construct the houses for their guards, and create infrastructure for a society that viewed them as less than human. The work was backbreaking and often pointless. Convicts were ordered to move massive piles of rocks from one location to another, then back again the next week. They built roads that led nowhere useful, carved out farms on lands too poor to sustain crops, and quarried stone for buildings that were never constructed. This wasn't inefficiency, it was psychological warfare designed to crush any hope of meaningful contribution or eventual freedom. Punishments for even the smallest infractions were medieval in their creativity and their cruelty. A convict could receive 50 lashes for speaking disrespectfully to a guard, 100 lashes for being caught with food rations, and 200 lashes for attempting escape. But here's the truly diabolical part. Some of these infractions were designed to be unavoidable. Convicts were given impossible quotas for daily work, ensuring that someone would always fail and provide an example for the others. As I mentioned earlier, female convicts faced a different kind of hell that was somehow both more and less visible than what the men endured. Outnumbered 10 to 1 by men, they were treated as property to be distributed among male convicts and soldiers. The official records speak delicately of assigning women to households as domestic servants, but the reality was forced concubinage and unpaid labor. Many were essentially sold into sexual slavery passed between men like trading cards. Yet there were some women, like Elizabeth MacArthur, who managed to build businesses and become influential figures, though their criminal origins were carefully erased from official histories once they became successful. This erasure is crucial to understanding Australia's original sin. Success was allowed to wash away the stain of convict origins, but only for those who played by the rules and never spoke about their experiences. The children born in these colonies grew up in a world where their mother's shame was their inheritance, where legitimacy was determined by crimes committed before their birth. These children, known as currency lads and lasses, to distinguish them from freeborn British immigrants, developed their own culture and identity that was neither fully British nor fully Australian. They were raised on stories of injustice and arbitrary punishment, creating a generation that inherently distrusted authority while simultaneously craving its approval. And now we're going to shift gears into an area that's not discussed as much, and it's absolutely crucial to understanding how this system poisoned everyone it touched. The soldiers and officers sent to guard these colonies often suffered alongside the convicts, creating a cycle of trauma that corrupted the entire social structure. Captain Watkin Tench wrote in his diary that he felt like a prisoner himself, trapped in a system that degraded everyone it touched. But his situation was more complex and tragic than simple imprisonment. Most of these men signed up for military service with dreams of honor, advancement, and serving their country. Instead, they found themselves becoming wardens in a continental prison, forced to brutalize people for crimes as minor as stealing food. The psychological toll was enormous. Imagine having to whip a man unconscious for speaking out of turn, and then knowing that you might be ordered to do the same thing to that same man tomorrow. Many officers wrote letters home describing nightmares, depression, and a growing sense that they had become the very criminals that they were meant to guard. These soldiers faced isolation more complete than anything modern people can imagine. No letters from home for months or years, no news from the outside world, no entertainment except alcohol and gambling. Disease was just as likely to kill them as the convicts. Malaria, dysentery, and scurvy didn't discriminate based on uniform. The hostile environment was constantly trying to kill them through snakes, spiders, extreme weather, and the ever-present threat of convict rebellion. Many soldiers eventually went insane from the isolation and stress. Some committed suicide, and others simply deserted into the wilderness to take their chances with the unknown rather than continue serving in this hellish system. It's honestly pretty disturbing how quickly many of them turned to the very behaviors that they were meant to prevent. Corruption became not just common, but necessary for psychological survival. Officers began selling supplies meant for convicts, accepting bribes to reduce punishments, or participating in the black market economy that sprang up around the colonies. Some became more brutal than necessary, finding release for their frustration and powerlessness by inflicting excessive punishment on convicts. Others became sympathetic to the convicts' plight and faced court-martial for being too lenient. The Rum Rebellion of 1808 perfectly illustrates how the system corrupted everyone involved, turning what should have been law enforcement into organized crime. Military officers became the colony's primary traders and land speculators, using rum as currency and convicts as unpaid labor for their personal business ventures. Governor William Bligh tried to stop this corruption and was literally overthrown in a military coup by the very officers meant to maintain order. So just think about that. The guards overthrew their own commander to protect their criminal enterprises. This wasn't aberrant behavior by a few bad actors. This was the logical outcome of a system that put people in impossible situations with no oversight, no accountability, and no hope of escape. The line between guardian and exploiter didn't just blur, it disappeared entirely. Officers were simultaneously victims of the system and perpetrators of its cruelties, creating a traumatized class of authority figures who would go on to shape Australian society for generations. Now let's go ahead and talk about being a clergyman assigned to provide spiritual comfort in this system that was explicitly designed to destroy human dignity and hope. This is where the story becomes almost surreal in its contradictions. Reverend Richard Johnson, the first chaplain, arrived with the First Fleet expecting to minister to a struggling but hopeful community working toward redemption. Instead, he found himself trying to preach about a merciful God to people who had been systematically dehumanized by supposedly Christian nations. Johnson's journal reveals a man slowly losing his faith in human goodness while desperately trying to maintain his faith in divine mercy. He describes having to conduct funeral services for convicts who died from preventable diseases, baptizing children born from rape, and trying to offer comfort to people who had been flogged nearly to death for trivial offenses. How do you explain divine justice to someone whose life has been destroyed for stealing food to feed their family? These religious leaders faced an impossible theological contradiction that went to the heart of Christian doctrine. How do you represent a merciful, loving God in a merciless system run by people who claim to be Christians? Some, like the infamous Samuel Marston, known as the Flogging Parson, resolved this contradiction by becoming complicit in the cruelty. Marston believed that brutal punishment was God's will for reforming criminal souls, and he personally oversaw floggings while quoting scripture about divine judgment. He became one of the colony's largest landowners, using convict labor while preaching about Christian charity. There were others, though, like Reverend Johnson, who fought against the system and advocated for convict rights, often facing persecution from colonial authorities who saw compassionate clergymen as threats to order and discipline. Johnson was repeatedly threatened, had his supplies cut off, and was eventually forced to leave the colony because his humanitarian views were seen as dangerous to maintaining control over the convict population. But once again, one of the haunting aspects of this spiritual dimension, the systematic destruction of hope, dignity, and faith wasn't accidental collateral damage. It was often deliberate policy. Colonial administrators understood that breaking people's spirits was more effective than breaking their bodies for maintaining long-term control. Religious services were sometimes used as venues for public humiliation, where convicts were forced to confess their sins in front of the entire community and beg forgiveness from God and the Crown. The clergymen's letters home described their horror at witnessing not just physical brutality, but what they called the spiritual death of an entire community. They watched as people lost all belief in justice, mercy, or redemption. Many convicts abandoned Christianity entirely, seeing it as the religion of their oppressors. Others developed a twisted version of faith that focused on revenge and divine retribution against their tormentors. The psychological damage was so severe that even convicts who eventually gained their freedom often struggled with depression, alcoholism, and an inability to form trusting relationships for the rest of their lives. So why do I keep calling this Australia's original sin? Because this wasn't just a policy failure or historical tragedy that happened and then ended. It was the deliberate construction of a society built on human suffering, where cruelty became normalized, systematic dehumanization became administrative policy, and where the powerful not only systematically erased the stories of the powerless, but made the erasure into a cultural virtue. We've mainly explored three perspectives today: convicts, soldiers, and clergymen. And they all reveal the same devastating truth. The penal colony system corrupted everyone it touched, creating cascading trauma that shaped Australian society for generations. Convicts were systematically dehumanized and then blamed for their own degradation. Soldiers became both enforcers and victims of institutionalized brutality, developing the authoritarian mindset that would characterize Australia's law enforcement for centuries. Clergymen either became complicit in cruelty or were marginalized for showing compassion, establishing a pattern where moral voices were silenced in favor of practical considerations. But here's what makes this truly an original sin rather than just historical injustice. The brutality didn't create a better society or even a functional one. It created a traumatized society that dealt with its trauma by inflicting it on others. The patterns established in the penal colonies became templates for how Australia would treat anyone deemed undesirable or threatening to social order. This history explains so much about modern Australia that you simply can't understand the country without grasping these foundations. The skepticism toward authority that Australians pride themselves on isn't just cultural personality, it's generational trauma from a society built on arbitrary and brutal authority. The harsh treatment of asylum seekers, the systematic erasure of Indigenous voices and rights, the cultural amnesia about convict origins, and the ongoing struggles with inequality and justice all trace directly back to these patterns established in the penal era. You also can't understand Australia's current immigration detention centers without understanding the penal colony mentality that sees certain people as inherently less deserving of basic human rights. You can't understand the decades of politics that tried to breed out Indigenous Australians without understanding a society that was founded on the principle that some people are disposable. You can't understand Australia's complicated relationship with its own history without recognizing that the country was literally built on forgetting and denying the experiences of the people who suffered to create it. This isn't just a history lesson. It's actually about how societies can normalize the unthinkable when they convince themselves it's necessary, practical, or even merciful. Every step of the way, the architects of the penal colony system had reasonable-sounding justifications for their actions. They were solving a prison crisis, giving criminals second chances, building a new society, spreading civilization, serving God and country. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and Australia's foundation was built on a highway of them. Unfortunately, we see this throughout history, how good people easily become complicit in evil systems when those systems were presented as normal, necessary, and even virtuous. The guards who brutalized convicts weren't monsters, they were ordinary men doing what their society told them was right and necessary. The officials who designed the systems weren't sadists, they were bureaucrats solving problems with the tools and mindset of their culture provided. The clergymen who justified cruelty weren't necessarily hypocrites, they genuinely believed they were serving God by supporting what they saw as divine justice. This is why understanding this history matters for your life today. We like to think we're more enlightened than previous generations, but the psychological and social mechanisms that enable the penal colony system are still operating in our world. When we see injustice happening to people we've been taught to see as less deserving, less human, or less worthy of concern, we're activating the same mental processes that allowed good people to participate in or ignore systematic cruelty. And that's all there is to it. Understanding the past isn't about assigning blame to people who are long dead or making modern Australians feel guilty about their ancestors' actions. It's about recognizing patterns that still shape our world today and understanding how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary cruelty when systems make that cruelty seem normal, necessary, or even virtuous. The story of Australia's penal colonies is ultimately a story about human nature under extreme conditions. How trauma spreads through generations, how institutions shape behavior, and how societies can convince themselves that their worst actions are actually their greatest achievements. It's a mirror that shows us not just Australian history, but the dark potential that exists in all human societies when we stop seeing certain people as fully human. Thanks for joining me today, guys. If this deep dive into Australia's dark origins got your curiosity engine running and made you think about how historical patterns influence our modern world, smash that like button and let me know in the comments which historical official story you'd like me to unpack next. Are you curious about other colonial experiments that shaped nations? Do you want me to explore how other societies dealt with crime and punishment? Or maybe you're interested in how trauma and resilience shaped cultures that emerged from these brutal systems. Don't forget to check out all of my sources in the description below. Your brain train journey doesn't have to end here. These books and academic papers contain even more detailed accounts and analysis that will blow your mind. Subscribe for more weekly adventures through history's most fascinating and often uncomfortable truths. And remember, the world isn't always this simple, but it's always this interesting. Keep questioning the stories you've been told, keep digging deeper into the complex realities behind simple narratives, and keep your curiosity engines running at full steam. All aboard for next week's adventures through the twists and turns of human history. We'll see you guys there. Bye.